The advocate arrived 17 minutes late to the disarmament ceremony, and nobody thought that was strange. That was the first thing Marin Solis noticed. Not the ships arranged in formation above New Carthage like a crown of teeth, not the quorum delegates in their environmental suits standing perfectly still on the platform, not even the silence, that particular quality of silence that had settled over the settlement like sediment after a flood. What she noticed was that the advocate arrived 17 minutes late, and none of the 300 quorum officials around her reacted at all. No glance exchanged, no subtle shift of posture, no whispered consultation. They simply waited, and when the advocate finally emerged from the transit pod in a column of pale amber light, they stood exactly as they had been standing, as if time had not passed for them. Marin filed that away. She filed it the way she had been filing things for 6 weeks, carefully, quietly, without letting her face change. She was the only human on the platform who was not in a ceremonial role. Her official designation was secondary linguistic liaison, which meant she was supposed to stand near the communication array and translate idiom when the primary translators failed. She had been selected because she was unimportant enough not to threaten anyone. That had been explained to her, not unkindly, by Commissioner Aldrich 3 days before the ceremony. "You're small," he'd said. "They respond better when we look small." She had not told him what she'd begun to suspect about why that mattered. The advocate stepped to the center of the platform and the ceremony began. The disarmament had been framed, publicly, as an agreement. The quorum's official communications called it the Velan Compact, named after the star system where first contact had been made 8 years earlier. Humanity's representatives called it a framework for protected integration. The quorum's ships held position 11,000 kilometers above a dozen Earth-settled worlds and called it a formality. Marin had read the original Velan transcripts. All of them, including the sections that had been redacted from public release, which she'd accessed through channels that officially didn't exist and that she would describe, if asked, as a clerical error. The transcripts showed something that the official summaries didn't mention. The quorum had not proposed disarmament. They had proposed categorization. Humanity was to be assessed, cataloged, and assigned a developmental tier. The disarmament was a consequence of that assessment, not a separate negotiation. Humanity had been assessed as Tier 3. Tier 3 meant pre-rational, capable of tool use and rudimentary cooperative behavior, but not yet possessing what the quorum termed structured restraint, the biological and social capacity to reliably limit violence in the absence of external enforcement. Most species encountered at Tier 3 were disarmed as a protective measure, like removing sharp objects from the environment of something that didn't yet understand what sharp meant. The commissioner knew about the tier system, so did the council. They had agreed anyway, because the alternative to agreement was a demonstration of what Tier 3 status actually implied about the quorum's willingness to enforce compliance. What they had not told the public was that Tier 3 categorization was permanent. Once assigned, it could not be appealed. It could only be revised, and revision required a petition submitted to a review body that met every 40 years on a schedule that had not yet been shared with humanity's representatives. Marin had found that in the transcripts too. She stood on the platform and watched the advocate accept the transmission codes that would disable Earth's planetary defense grid, and she thought about the 40 years, and she filed it away. The ceremony lasted 4 hours. At its conclusion, the quorum ships adjusted their orbital positions, and humanity was officially, legally, cosmically unarmed. There was a reception afterward, held in the settlement's main assembly hall. The quorum delegates did not eat or drink, but they attended, because the advocate had apparently determined that witnessing human consumption behavior was observationally valuable. Marin moved through the room with a glass of something sparkling that she wasn't drinking, and she listened. She was good at listening. She had learned it from her mother, who had been a diagnostician in a region with unreliable medical equipment, which meant that listening was the primary diagnostic tool. Her mother had told her that people almost always told you what was wrong if you were quiet long enough that they forgot you were there. The quorum delegates were not people, but they forgot she was there anyway. What she heard, in fragments, in translated pieces that she assembled in the silence of her own mind, was this: the quorum was not concerned about humanity's weapons. They were concerned about something they were calling, in their own language, a word that translated approximately as the persistence problem. She caught it from two separate conversations, spoken by delegates who had no reason to know they were near a translator, which meant they weren't being careful, which meant they thought it was a safe topic to discuss in the presence of the small, unimportant human standing near the communication array. She did not look up. She did not reach for her recording device. She memorized it and filed it away. 6 weeks later, the stars started burning, not metaphorically. Not in the poetic sense that history sometimes describes turning points. The second planet in the Kepler 442 system, which humanity had been in the early stages of terraforming before the compact required suspension of all expansion activities, experienced an atmospheric ignition event that no natural model adequately explained. The quorum was the first to send observation craft. They studied the event for 9 days, and issued a statement indicating the event was consistent with residual combustion from legacy human industrial equipment that had been abandoned in violation of compact decommissioning protocols. Marin read the statement in her small apartment in New Carthage. Then she read it again. Then she opened the file she had been building for 6 weeks, and she added the statement to it, and she sat very still for a long time. The problem with the statement was that Kepler 442b had no legacy human industrial equipment. The terraforming program had been in early survey stages. There were sensor arrays. There were 3 atmospheric monitoring buoys. There was nothing on that planet that could produce an atmospheric ignition of sufficient scale to be visible from the system's outer belt. The quorum knew that. They had the same survey data humanity did. The compact had required full data sharing as part of the categorization process. So the quorum was lying, and they knew she could prove they were lying, and they had issued the statement anyway. That was not the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that Marin couldn't figure out why. She was not naive about politics or institutions or the various reasons that powerful bodies issued false statements. She understood cover stories. What she couldn't understand was what the quorum was covering, because the only alternative to their explanation was that something had burned Kepler 442b's atmosphere from inside, and the only things that could do that were things that should not exist in a region that had been under quorum observation for 8 years. She opened a channel to the only person she had trusted with any part of what she'd been doing. His name was Dov. He was officially a geological survey coordinator, which was a role that required him to spend large amounts of time in places where nobody was watching him, which had made him useful to her in ways she had not initially anticipated and had since come to depend on. He was also one of the most stubborn people she had ever met, which she had initially considered a personality flaw and had since revised. "Tell me about the survey teams," she said when he picked up. "The ones that were supposed to decommission the Kepler sites." There was a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "What specifically," he said, "do you want to know? Whether they finished?" Another pause. Marin, his voice had a quality she'd learned to recognize. It was the quality of someone choosing words carefully in a situation where the wrong word had consequences. "The survey teams filed completion reports. All of them, I know. I read the reports." "Okay. Dov, did they finish?" The pause this time was different, longer, the kind that meant he was deciding how much to tell her, not because he didn't trust her but because telling her made it real in a way that couldn't be undone. "The reports," he said finally, "are accurate regarding the official equipment. Every cataloged system, every registered installation. All of it was decommissioned per compact specifications." He stopped, but she said, "I'm not saying anything else on this channel." The line closed. She sat with what he hadn't said for a long time. Then she thought about the 40 years. Then she thought about what a species does when it has 40 years and no weapons and something very important to protect, and the knowledge that rational cooperation has already failed. She requested a meeting with the quorum advocate through the official liaison channel, which meant it was routed through 6 administrative layers and would normally take 3 to 5 weeks to schedule. The response came back in 4 hours. That had never happened before. She was given a meeting slot the following morning in the Quorum administrative facility that had been established in the northern part of the settlement. She had been inside the facility once before, during the early liaison training period, and she remembered it as a place designed to make humans feel small. Not aggressively. The Quorum didn't do aggression, which was part of what made them so difficult to understand. The ceilings were simply higher than human architecture required. The doorways were slightly too wide. The lighting existed at frequencies that human eyes processed as dim even when the intensity would have been adequate for the species producing it. Nothing was hostile. Everything was wrong in ways that were just subtle enough to make you uncertain whether you were imagining it. The advocate met her in a room that contained 4 chairs arranged in a configuration that wasn't quite a circle. The advocate occupied one. Marin sat across from it. The other 2 chairs remained empty. She had prepared 3 questions and decided on the walkover to ask only one. "I'd like to understand," she said, "what the Quorum means by the persistence problem." The advocate was still for exactly the length of time it took Marin to become certain that she had miscalculated badly and that this meeting was going to end in a way she hadn't prepared for. Then it spoke. "Where did you encounter that term?" "In conversation." "At the reception following the compact ceremony." She kept her voice at a particular register, not casual enough to seem dismissive, not formal enough to seem afraid. "Is it a classified designation? It is an internal analytical category. It was not intended for liaison dissemination." Another pause and then something Marin had not expected. "You memorized the conversation." "I'm a translator. I memorize conversations." "You were not translating at that point in the evening." "No," she agreed. "I was listening." The advocate was still again. She had noticed that it went still the way something goes still when it is processing, not the way something goes still when it is waiting. There was a quality of internal activity to its stillness that she found harder to read than motion. "The persistence problem," it said finally, "is a categorization challenge. It refers to a pattern of behavior observed in several pre-rational species in which certain adaptive behaviors persist beyond the conditions that produced them. In most cases, this is not significant. The behaviors attenuate as environmental conditions change. And in the other cases, in rare cases, the behaviors persist despite the elimination of the original conditions. They become decoupled from rational cause and effect. The species continues engaging in the behavior even when the behavior no longer produces survival-relevant outcomes." Marin kept her expression at the particular setting she had been practicing. "That sounds," she said carefully, "like a definition of irrational behavior." "Yes." And the Quorum assessed humanity as exhibiting this pattern. "The assessment," the advocate said, "is ongoing." She walked back to her apartment in the cold morning air of New Carthage, and she spent the rest of the day thinking about what the advocate had been afraid of. Because she was certain, now, that it had been afraid of something. The stillness had been too long. The final answer had been chosen too carefully, and it had not asked her how she planned to use the information it had just given her, which was a question that any rational administrator should have asked. Unless the advocate had already concluded that asking was pointless. The second atmospheric event happened 11 days later. This one was not Kepler 442b. It was a small uninhabited moon in the outer reach of the Gliese system, which humanity had surveyed in the year before the compact, and had made no claims on, because the moon's geology was unstable, and the terraforming cost analysis had returned negative outcomes across all modeled scenarios. There was no possible way to attribute this event to abandoned human equipment. The Quorum issued no statement. Marin was awake at 3 a.m. when the sensor reports came through on the monitoring feeds she had requested access to on the grounds that her liaison work required awareness of regional incidents. She read them twice. Then she opened the file she had been building and she looked at it for a very long time. The file was, by now, substantial. It contained the redacted Vellon transcripts. The assessment records the statement about Kepler 442b. notes from 17 conversations she had memorized, a timeline, a map of the decommissioned survey sites cross-referenced with the locations of both atmospheric events, and a single document that Dov had sent her through a channel that was technically a geological data relay, and that she had nearly missed because it was embedded in a rock strata analysis, as a set of numbers that were not coordinates for anything that appeared on the official survey maps. She had figured out what the numbers meant on day 3 of staring at them. What they described was something she had not been able to fully accept even after she understood it. The survey teams had decommissioned everything official, everything registered, everything that appeared in any database that the compact data sharing protocols covered. But the compact required data sharing for all documented activities, and certain activities, conducted during the period between the Velen contact and the formal compact signing, a period of 14 months during which humanity knew disarmament was coming, but had not yet agreed to it, had never been documented. Not because they were hidden in any dramatic sense, but because the people who had conceived of them had understood that documentation was a form of vulnerability and they had made decisions accordingly. Not weapons. The compact had been careful. The categorization process had been thorough. Everything that functioned as a weapon had been inventoried and disabled. But the compact had said nothing about geology. She stared at the map. The 2 atmospheric events. The locations of 6 other sites she could see in Dov's encoded data. Something had been placed inside those moons and planets, not weapons. Something that operated on timescales that made weapons look like a temporary solution. Something designed to work after 40 years, after 80 years. After the kind of timescale that a species facing permanent Tier 3 categorization calculates when it does the math on what permanent actually means and decides that mathematics is not the only tool available. She thought about the advocate's phrase, decoupled from rational cause and effect, the persistence problem, and she thought, sitting alone at 3 a.m. in a small apartment on a disarmed world, that the quorum had identified something real. They just hadn't understood what it was. She requested a second meeting. This time the response came back in 40 minutes. The advocate met her in the same room, the same configuration of chairs. This time when Marin sat down, she noticed that the advocate had positioned itself differently, not in the chair it had occupied before, but in one of the ones that had been empty. She couldn't tell if that was significant or if she was looking for patterns in things that didn't contain them. She had started doing that more recently. She filed the uncertainty away. "I have a question about the Gleaser event," she said. "There are no official findings on the Gleaser event. I know. That's why I'm asking you instead of reading a statement." The advocate was still. "What is your question? I'd like to know whether the quorum believes the 2 events are connected. What is your basis for the premise that they might be? The absence of any natural model that accounts for either of them independently. And the fact that both sites were surveyed by human teams in the 14 months before the compact." The advocate's stillness had a different quality now. She had become attuned to its variations, in the same way she had learned to read the variations in her mother's diagnostic pauses. This one was not the stillness of processing. It was the stillness of something that had arrived at a conclusion it was not certain how to respond to. "You have been conducting independent analysis," it said. "I'm a translator. Analysis is part of understanding context. You have access to data beyond liaison requirements. I filed the appropriate access requests. She had. Every single one was documented and approved. She had been meticulous. Is there a policy concern I should be aware of? No." And then, after a pause that was longer than any previous one, "Are there humans who anticipated this outcome?" She looked at the advocate. She held the look for exactly long enough. "I'm not sure I understand the question," she said. She understood the question precisely. The question was whether the atmospheric events were intentional. The question was whether some group of humans, in the 14 months before the compact, had placed something in those systems knowing what it would do and knowing when it would do it. The question was whether humanity had been pretending to be disarmed, while the actual plan operated on a geological timescale that no weapons inspection could detect. She did not answer it. The advocate did not press. What happened instead was this. the advocate said in a register she had not heard it used before, something that her translation protocols rendered as we may have made an error in our assessment. Not there may have been an error, not the assessment process may require review. We may have made. She walked home. She called Dov. They know something is happening, she said. They don't know what. How long before they figure it out? Longer than they have, she said. And she meant something specific by that, something she had worked out during the walk back, something that had been forming at the edge of her understanding for weeks and had finally become fully visible. The quorum moved on institutional timescales, review bodies that met every 40 years, categorization processes that took years to initiate, a bureaucratic pace that was, for a species with their lifespan, probably efficient, probably rational. But the things placed inside those moons and planets had been designed by people who had done the calculation and known that the quorum would move at that pace, had relied on it, had built around it the way you build a lock around a key you know someone can't duplicate. Dov, she said, how many sites? Another of his careful pauses. Officially, I coordinate surveys in this system and the two adjacent ones. How many sites? Marin, please. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't. I was given one set of coordinates. Other people were given other coordinates. Nobody was given the complete map. That was intentional. She stopped walking. Nobody was given the complete map, she said. It was a security decision. If any one person was ever questioned, nobody knows how many there are. Silence. Nobody was supposed to need to know, he said quietly. The events are autonomous. They don't need coordination. They don't need to be triggered. They run on their own schedule, and the schedule was calculated to be active before the first review period. She breathed, before the 40 years. Closer to 12, the projections suggested. But yes. She stood in the cold air of New Carthage and she looked up at the sky and she thought about the shape of what humanity had done. Not defiantly, not proudly, with the kind of quiet, terrible clarity that her mother had described as the moment a diagnosis becomes certain. A species told it was irrational had rationally concluded that its rationality would not be recognized. A species told it was incapable of structured restraint had restrained itself. Carefully, methodically, across 14 months of coordination that had left no centralized record and been carried out by people who did not know each other's full scope of contribution. A species told to surrender its weapons had done so completely, literally, precisely, and had then done something for which the compact had no language because the compact had not imagined it. Not weapons. Evidence. Evidence, accumulating in geological timescale, that something had been here. That something had modified these places in ways that would take the quorum decades to catalog and centuries to fully understand. A fingerprint on a scale that no disarmament treaty could define as armament, because it was not designed to hurt anyone. It was designed to prove, irrefutably, to any civilization sufficiently advanced to read the data, that humanity had been in these systems, had operated here, had shaped these environments in ways that demonstrated not aggression but capability, the specific kind of capability that the quorum's categorization system called the primary marker of Tier 2 status. Structured restraint, the ability to limit violence in the absence of external enforcement. The events were not burning, they were signing, across light years, across decades. A species that had been told it could not write its own name in the stars had found a pen the treaty didn't cover and had been writing, quietly, for years. The third event was different. It was in a system that was not uninhabited. It was a quorum administrative relay station, unmanned, automated, but clearly quorum infrastructure. And the event was not atmospheric. The event was a geological restructuring of the station's host asteroid that had, according to the sensor data Marin pulled at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, rearranged approximately 16% of the asteroid's mass in a pattern that did not occur in nature and had not been caused by any registered human activity. Because no human had registered any activity in that system. Because the person or people who had placed something in that asteroid had not been given coordinates for a quorum station. They had been given coordinates for what the survey data the compact had required humanity to share, showed as an uninhabited rock in a low-traffic corridor. But the survey data had been 8 months old when it was shared, and 8 months was enough time for a quorum relay station to be placed in a location that had previously been empty. Marin sat with that for a long time. The humans who had designed the Persistence Project, she had started calling it that in the privacy of her own mind, had been careful, meticulous. But they had not known where every quorum installation was, because the quorum had not shared that data, and the compact had not required them to. And now something that had been intended as a geological signature of human presence had produced itself inside a quorum station, and the quorum knew about it, and they could not plausibly attribute it to legacy equipment or natural events. She called Dov at 2:30 a.m. He answered immediately, which meant he'd been awake. "I know," he said before she spoke. "How bad, I don't know. I still don't have the full map, Marin. Nobody does. Dov, is there anything in this system?" A pause that felt different from all the previous ones. "Heavier. I was given one set of coordinates in this system," he said. "They're not in the settlement zone. They're not near anything that was inhabited when the surveys were done." He stopped. "I can't promise they're not near anything that's inhabited now." She closed her eyes. "How long?" she said. "Could be years. Could be less. The activation windows have variants built in." She thought about what it meant. She thought about a species that had made a plan in 14 months, distributed across people who didn't know each other's parts, with no central record and no override, with a schedule that ran autonomously and could not be stopped because nobody knew where all the sites were. And she thought about the quorum advocate sitting in that room and saying, "We may have made an error." The error was not in the assessment. The assessment had, in its own way, been correct. Humanity did exhibit the persistence problem, behaviors that persisted beyond their original conditions, actions that continued past the point where rational analysis would have predicted cessation. What the quorum had failed to understand was that this was not a malfunction. It was the mechanism. A species that had survived on a violent, unpredictable, resource-scarce world by developing the capacity to act in the present for outcomes it would never live to see, to build cathedrals that would take a century to complete, to plant trees whose shade would shelter grandchildren not yet born, to encode laws and principles and obligations to the future as though the future were a person standing in the room, someone you had made a promise to, someone you could not let down. The persistence problem was not about irrationality. It was about the particular shape of human time. The advocate requested a meeting with her. She found that worth noting, in the same way she had found the 17-minute delay worth noting at the ceremony. The inversion was meaningful. The advocate initiating contact rather than receiving, it suggested that the calculus inside the quorum's administrative process had shifted, and she spent the walk to the facility trying to model how. The room had been changed. The chairs were in a different configuration. There were more of them. 7, she counted, arranged in a shape that her geometric intuition identified as a deliberate choice rather than a logistical one. She sat in the chair closest to the door. The advocate came in with 2 others she had not seen before. They took chairs without introduction. "I want to share information with you," the advocate said, "and I want to ask you to share information in return. I am proposing this as an exchange conducted in the spirit of the compact's cooperative framework, without prejudicial implication to either party's categorization status." Marin recognized the legal structure of that sentence. It meant, nothing you say in this room can be used to reclassify humanity. It also meant the advocate had consulted with administrative counsel before this meeting, and this structure had been deliberately established, which meant the quorum was uncertain about what she knew and was trying to find out without creating a record that could be used adversarially. "I appreciate that framing," she said. "I'm prepared to engage in that spirit. We have identified 23 anomalous events in the past 4 months. 12 of those are in systems with previous human survey activity. 11 are in systems that have no documented human presence." The advocate paused. "We do not have a model that accounts for the 11. Marin thought about what Dov had said. Survey data that was 8 months old. A quorum administrative system that had placed installations without sharing their locations. Is it possible, she said carefully, that some of those 11 are in locations that were not human presence at the time of the original surveys but might have had human activity during the survey period? The silence that followed was very long. That is a precise question, the advocate said. I'm a translator. Precision is part of my function. We would need to cross-reference installation dates. And then, you are suggesting that the human activity preceded the quorum activity at some of those locations. I'm suggesting that the timeline might be more complicated than it appears. One of the two silent figures in the room made a sound that Marin's translation protocols identified as non-linguistic and that she privately categorized as distress. She did not look at it directly. Ms. Solis, the advocate said, "Do you know the scope of what has been placed?" She held the question for a moment, examining it from different angles. "No," she said. "That was true. I know that the people who designed the project made certain that no one person would know the full scope. That was also true. I believe that was a security decision." She paused. "I also believe it means the project cannot be reversed or halted through any action taken against any individual or group." The stillness in the room had a quality she had never encountered before. It was the stillness of three beings simultaneously arriving at the same understanding and finding it larger than any of them had prepared for. "You are describing," the advocate said, "a system specifically designed to be inalienable. I'm describing what I understand from the information available to me." Ms. Solis. The advocate's register was different. It had been different throughout this meeting. "I want to ask you a question that is outside the formal cooperative framework. I am asking it personally in whatever sense that term applies across our categories of being." A pause. "Were humans afraid?" She looked at the advocate. She thought about her mother, listening to the spaces between words for the location of what was wrong. She thought about Dav's pauses, each one a carefully weighted decision. She thought about people who had spent 14 months building something in pieces, never seeing the whole, trusting that others were building the same thing in their own corners of the galaxy, motivated by nothing except the knowledge that their children would inherit whatever outcome they managed to engineer in the time they had. "Yes," she said, "we were very afraid. And yet you acted. Yes. In a manner specifically designed to persist beyond any capacity we might have to respond to it. Yes. Why?" She looked at the advocate for a long moment. "Because being afraid," she said, "has never been a reason to stop." The 23rd event was in this system. She found out 3 days later, from a sensor report that came through her monitoring feed with a priority flag that meant it had been automatically escalated to all senior administrative personnel. The event was a geological phenomenon in the outer belt. A slow process, she read, that would not complete for another 4 to 7 years, which meant it had been initiated years before the compact was signed, which meant the person who had placed it there had been operating before first contact was even fully established. Someone had looked at the stars before the quorum had ever arrived and had made a decision that was indistinguishable from the outside from faith. Faith that the future was a place worth spending yourself for. Faith that the thing you built now would matter to someone who hadn't been born yet. Faith that your actions accumulated over time into something larger than your individual life could contain. The quorum had called this the persistence problem. They had identified it as a cognitive anomaly, a failure of rational cost-benefit analysis, a marker of developmental immaturity. What they had failed to understand was that you could not disarm it. There was no treaty language for it. There was no categorization tier that contained it. It was not located in a weapons system or a military installation or a defensible position. It lived in the shape of human time, in the particular way that humans experience the future as something real, something inhabited, something that looked back at you with the eyes of people you loved and asked whether you had done enough. You could take away every weapon. You could catalog every satellite and disable every defense grid and inspect every registered installation. You could do all of that and humanity would still be sitting quietly in the corner of the room, filing things away. The galaxy had just discovered that some problems don't have solutions. Some species don't have an off switch. Some fears don't function as deterrents because the thing you're threatening the species with is less frightening than what happens if they do nothing. Marin Soli sat in her small apartment in New Carthage and watched the sensor data scroll past and thought about the 40 years that had been so precisely calculated to outlast them. And she understood in the way that her mother had taught her to understand, not through analysis, but through the sudden, total clarity of a thing that had always been true becoming undeniable, that the stars were not burning, they were waking up. And the quorum was only now beginning to realize what humanity had known since before the first ship arrived, that you cannot disarm a species that has already decided the future is worth more than the present, because everything they do, every quiet act, every distributed plan, every sacrifice made in isolation by someone who will never see what it becomes, is a weapon the galaxy has no name for. It is called caring what happens after you are gone. And they had scattered it like seeds across the dark between the stars,